not lose weight, because it is a well-known fact that it's much harder to lose weight as you get older and you start to get into this phase, and I'll explain why. So for one, and the main reason is going to be that you have lower levels of estrogen, like I mentioned, and estrogen is our primary anabolic hormone, meaning it's most contributing to our ability to put on and retain muscle mass. And if you guys came to my first presentation where I talked about like calories in versus calories out and your overall metabolism, muscle basically requires more energy to sustain, right? So as your lean tissue starts to decrease, obviously your expenditure, your metabolic expenditure, how many calories you're burning at rest due to your own physique also decreases. So that's a factor to consider. Also, sarcopenia is also, it's muscle mass loss due to age, but obviously that's also very common for men. And it's hard to necessarily combat as in completely stop it, but there are things you can do, which we'll talk about. You also have an increased risk of insulin resistance, which is going to lead to more abdominal weight gain. I'm not sure if you are familiar with what insulin resistance is, but we'll definitely talk about it because this is a huge component of perimenopause. So insulin resistance is the primary symptom, I guess you could say, of diabetes or prediabetes. And then again, poor sleep, which is very common, which leads to lower energy levels and therefore dysregulation in appetite and cravings. So our hunger and satiation hormones are also controlled by our sleep, right? So you see how these things all kind of factor in. So the irregularities in estrogen and progesterone cause sleep disturbances, which then affect our hormones, our hunger and satiation hormones, which then lead to cravings, which can lead to overeating, and so on, right? So it's kind of a vicious cycle of all of these things happening, and obviously being prompted by these imbalances in estrogen and progesterone. And then the last part is also the increased stress level. So we're going through a big cognitive and neurological change during this time with much higher stress levels on our body. So that's something to also factor in. And one of the main reasons why mindfulness practices, stress management in general makes such a big difference during this time. But it can also lead to obviously increased cortisol and therefore increased systemic inflammation. So higher levels of the stress hormone cortisol can increase how much water you hold in your body, which obviously can also make you feel puffier, feel heavier, increase your weight on the scale, and so on. So we're just gonna now shift into some of the things that you can do to combat, obviously, these fluctuations and how they affect you. So we'll start with training. And obviously, all of you guys are here, so you do some kind of training, but biggest thing, and I'm sure that you've probably heard this, put an emphasis on strength training. So biggest area of focus should be maintaining lean tissue for metabolic optimization, like I said. Really place an emphasis on lifting weights, and I'll talk more about lifting heavy weights and why you should do it, because it's gonna help you with maintaining the lean tissue that you already have. It's very hard to actually put on lean tissue after this point, once you get to a specific point, because of the decline in estrogen, unless you're on hormone replacement. So the best thing you could do is strengthen the muscle fibers that you have, because it helps with your bones and joints and your general movement patterns, so that you could prevent falls and breaks and things like that. And also because it helps tremendously with insulin management, which, like I said, we'll also talk about. And all of this can be achieved with consistent training, the management of some of these symptoms. And then types of training, just as examples, CrossFit, obviously you guys are here, so you can do CrossFit, but I just gave some examples here. So CrossFit, obviously a lot of strength training within that, time under tension training, which I focus a lot within my coaching as well, but just very modern age bodybuilding, where you focus a lot more on keeping muscles contracted for longer duration of time, rather than just progressive overload. So it's a safer way to lift, and it still places that stressor on your muscles to create an adaptive response, basically to stimulate what's called hypertrophy, right? Muscle growth or muscle development. And then I just gave some other examples. Honestly, any kind of resistance training, like anything that places some kind of stressor on your muscles, is great. Pilates and yoga are also a little bit more gentle for some people. Body weight exercises or anything else. TRX, honestly, whatever you want. Resistance bands, but anything that you can do that will emphasize some kind of resistance training will be helpful. And then just obstacles with this. This is something that some of you may have gone through or may go through at some point, so I think it's just important to be aware of it, because it'll help you combat it or have strategies to do so. So again, you might be dealing with lower energy, and that could be due to the irregularities with the high estrogen and low progesterone. Could also be due to poor sleep, and then slower recovery because of it. So obviously that's something to always factor in, you know, so as a suggestion, let's say you are used to training 5 days a week, maybe you could drop down to 3 days a week, right? And make your training more manageable. Maybe you were doing hour-long workouts, now you could do 30 to 40-minute long workouts. I always say, do what's most sustainable for you with the most longevity, meaning don't just do what you can do for a few weeks at a time and then burn out and not do anything. Do something that you can do for the rest of your life and keep adjusting that. So for example, for me, I used to work out 7 days a week. My best friend Patrick, we would do 2 to 3 hours of training and then, you know, gradually cut down to 6, gradually cut down to 5, which I thought was crazy. And now I train 4 days a week because I just don't have the physical and mental bandwidth with, you know, having kids in my life and career and everything to do more, and that's fine. I don't think that doing 4 days is any less than doing 7 days because I feel great. So it's gonna always be up to you on what you can consistently do based on your schedule. Also another obstacle, you know, slower results. I hear a lot of most of my clients are women in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And a lot of times we talk about how much harder it is for them now and how much easier it was in their 20s and 30s. And you know, the thing is, it's not apples to apples. And I always suggest look at where you are relative to where you started at this point in life, not where you were when you were in high school or college or when you turned 30, because you're in a different phase of your life, whether it be with stressors, genetics, hormones. So just always look at the progress that you're making relative to where you are now, which is the most important. And then honestly, mental blocks, you know, we all go through it, and I'm sure obviously as women with different parts of your cycle, you've had times where like, I just don't fucking feel like doing anything today, right? Or you feel sad, you feel depressed, you feel demotivated. Just know that those times will come. So having some kind of support group around you, or strategy, or something else that maybe you could do instead of training that day. So I always recommend, if you don't feel like training, go do mobility or go for a walk and listen to a podcast, right? Like there's always something that you can do that may still make you feel productive or make you feel like you're progressing in a sense. So biggest takeaways when it comes to training, don't be afraid to lift weights. Remember, lifting weights or your training is going to determine your shape, your physique, right? Your symmetry, your muscle tissue. Your nutrition is going to determine your size, how big or small you are. It doesn't matter how heavy the weights that you're lifting are if you're not in a caloric surplus. You can't gain weight or increase muscle size unless you're in a caloric surplus. So if you're not gaining weight, it doesn't matter how heavy you're lifting, you're also not going to gain muscle. If you're seeing changes in your muscle, it's typically because you've reduced body fat and now you could see the muscle tone that you have. I also hear all the time from women especially, like, I want to be toned, or I want to be shredded, and what I say is, if there's nothing to tone, it doesn't matter how little you eat or how much you eat, because you're not going to look toned. So heavy emphasis obviously on lifting weights because it will make a difference in your physique. And as a last point, push to failure as often as possible within isolated movements. So you're doing tricep extensions or lat pull downs or bicep curls or dumbbell chest presses. Push to failure as often as possible because that's what's going to place that adaptive stressor on your muscles. If you're doing, let's say 15 reps and you pick the weight that you could have done 5, 10, 15 more, just know that you're not doing anything as far as this goal. Pick a weight that will allow you to get to 15 and maybe you have 1 to 2 reps left in the tank with good form. For bigger compound movements like squats, deadlifts, things like that, 1 to 2 reps in reserve. You never want to actually push to failure or push to failure as little as possible because it's very taxing on your central nervous system. So it'll stunt your overall volume. Any questions? Yes.
So at my age, I'm 41, how hard is it to build muscle versus just maintaining muscle at my age, and what should my goals be? Like, what's a realistic? Is it better to maintain and not build anymore because I'm older?
So I think age is subjective because it depends on where you're at within that perimenopause transition. You might still be far away from that. And I would look at that more and kind of isolate symptoms that you might be feeling because it can also be hard to figure it out with blood work. Just different times of the month when you test your blood work might be indicative of it, it might not, but typically you want to go based on symptoms. But I mean, you look great, you move great, so I'd say for you it's, I would always say, what's your goal and what's the most effective way for you to get there based on where you're at in life, and make it realistic, right? So I always tell everyone as well that I work with, if your goal isn't realistically sustainable, meaning let's say you want to lose 20 pounds, but for you to lose 20 pounds, you're eating like 800 calories and feeling like shit all the time, that might be your goal, but that goal is so unsustainable that is it realistic, or are you willing to sacrifice all of these things to hold on to this? And those are the questions that you have to ask yourself.
Change once you hit perimenopause? Like all of like hitting your caloric goals? Does that change like the levels and stuff? I don't know if that makes sense with how I asked it.
It can, but also, like I said, it changes because of all of those indirect effects. So at the end of the day, remember calories in, calories out, which is on this next slide I'll show you right now, which we're going to talk about. Calories in, calories out is always going to be the basis of any weight gain or weight loss. It doesn't matter where you're at in life, if your hormones are low, if they're high. What happens is that this calories out equation becomes more inefficient. So let's say you have a thyroid issue, or you have insulin resistance, or you're feeling the effects of the changes in hormones, right? Like you're sleeping like shit, so therefore you're not working out as much, you're not working out as hard, you're not making good choices with your eating because you're getting cravings. All that's doing is making this equation inefficient. So at the end of the day, your goal should always be making this equation efficient for you, right? So if hormones are the problem, you could look into supplements, you could look into hormone replacement, you could look into more naturopathic ways if you're into that. If it's the effects of those hormones, like let's say you're sleeping terribly, you can do something for your sleep, right? So it's kind of tackling each of those issues individually, but that's all that's happening is this equation is becoming inefficient. And none of us can fight sarcopenia, basically. Like there's gonna, and we're gonna talk about that as well, and I'll give you guys a better breakdown of percentages. None of us can avoid muscle loss over time, unless we're taking like crazy HGH and shit like that, right? But now we're not talking about natural conditions anymore. So all of this is referring to under natural conditions. You're not taking anything exogenously.
So is it impossible for us to gain muscle?
It's not impossible, it's much harder. So because of that decline in estrogen, and I have a picture of this at the end, and this is the best way I could tell you, like during reproductive years when everything's optimal, think of like you're literally walking on flat road, you're super happy, you're going to your destination with no impediments. When you get to like perimenopause, kind of leading into menopause, it's like you're walking up a hill with a backpack full of rocks. You could still get to your destination, but it's much harder to get there. So the problem is a lot of women will give up because of how difficult that journey is. It doesn't mean you can't get there. It means that your margin of error is smaller and you have to work harder. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Jane. I'm gonna tell you something good because I had a baby at 42, my first one, and I started CrossFit at 42 and a month, whatever. So it was quick, and I gained so much muscle. I mean, such good muscle, but also I always worked out, and I was a gymnast, I was a dancer, all that, but never anything like CrossFit. But still very, very hard, but still nothing like CrossFit. And I mean, I gained such muscle, and so yes, and I can't imagine. Like I said, I had a baby, so and nobody was talking about menopause or perimenopause. I'm sure I was probably in something like that soon after that. And I mean, not 42, but I'm at 45. I was gaining muscle, and I even had things that I can wear, like not tank tops, blazers, where it was just and it's hard for women. Like my whole thing is when people go, I don't want to lift weights. I don't want to get too bulky. I'm like, what? You can't even imagine what it takes to get that. So. But you know how CrossFit is and how you can be. I mean, it's the first time I was doing pull-ups and such an amazing amount of them and all that. So I'm not saying it's easy, but I was definitely CrossFitting a lot, and I was absolutely gaining muscle.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. Like you can still do it. It's just that it gets harder and harder as you get older. So you want to capitalize as much as possible, as early as possible, and lift weights as early as possible in your life. So it makes that transition period much easier. So you could still gain muscle, but just remember it's a little bit harder, and that's all it is. When you get to the point of menopause and you're no longer producing estrogen at all and you're not on hormone replacement, there's no anabolic hormone to help you gain muscle. So you cannot actually physically increase your muscle size. That's not to say you can't strengthen the muscles you have, right? Which is obviously a very distinct difference. So it depends. So if you're referring to actual hypertrophy, like you want to increase muscle size, that becomes much harder. But again, you're 41, so I would, it's so subjective. You could still not hit perimenopause until you're 48.
That's all genetic.
Yeah, it's a lot of it's genetics. Like I said, you could just ask your mom.
Yeah. I thought about this kind of stuff. I really haven't, and like having a seminar really helps me kind of open my eyes.
Yeah, like my mom's 57 and she still hasn't hit menopause. I'm like, yes, thank God. Yeah, so I'm hoping for the same. But to your point, Jade, I agree that a lot of women are very afraid of lifting weights because they think it's gonna make them bulky. And you guys have no idea. I posted an Instagram reel that I think is like my most viral reel about the the amount of women that I've had look at me or ask me for coaching and say, you look great, but I'd never want to look like you. And you know, it's something that for me was psychologically hard at first. And my husband's also, you know, huge. He's a huge bodybuilder and he gets it all the time. He was always like, what I tell people is like, don't worry, like you can't even if you try. Like it's so much harder than people think it actually is, you know? So a lot of these things are unfortunately like myths. Like lifting weights in isolation is not gonna make you gain muscle unless you're really focusing on that. And there's so many inputs that are required, like recovery is a huge component, eating in a surplus, eating adequate protein, and then again, placing a stimulus on your muscles that create that adaptive response. So I used to think that I had this crazy propensity for building muscle. You guys can ask Patrick. I would be so just upset all the time because I would lift weights and be like, man, I'm getting so jacked. And I did DEXA scans like 4 years apart and I gained 0.2 pounds of muscle. Like I guess that wasn't my goal. I wasn't trying to gain muscle, but I was always in my head that I would be gaining all this muscle and I would just look crazy jacked. And even with as hard as I trained, I wasn't actually growing my muscle tissue, if that makes sense. I was just getting leaner so you could see more of my definition. Yes, Patrick.
For a female athlete, is it important to take in more estrogen once you do realize that you're symptomatic of perimenopause? Like, if the goal is to either maintain or gain muscle?
So that's actually a really good question, and we'll talk about hormone replacement, but you actually want to focus more on progesterone first because remember your estrogen is still spiking really high, so you actually don't want to take estrogen right off the bat unless you're having issues with low estrogen because then you're going to make those peaks and troughs even bigger. You want progesterone to offset the effects of that spiking estrogen at that time. And then you want to talk to your doctor about taking estrogen right as you're leading into menopause, and there's a very short window of maybe like a year or two once you've hit menopause that you could start with estrogen. If not, it actually becomes medically dangerous for reasons that I don't know enough to explain to you, but there's a very short window that you could start taking estrogen during when you hit menopause. Women that do take hormone replacement that's more estrogen focused, like patches, things like that, have an issue with their, like they've figured out at that point that their estrogen is already decreasing and they're on the tail end of perimenopause, in which case they could do both progesterone and estrogen. But progesterone is what you definitely want to look into. You could do it topically, you could do oral tablets and your doctor. And I will tell you guys, when I say your doctor, it is so hard to find a good doctor. It's hard to find a holistic doctor that thinks outside the box, that isn't just going to put you on birth control. So I would say inform yourself as much as you can so you can ask the right questions. I've had plenty of doctors I've worked with that were complete shit, and I'm just thankful that I knew enough to disregard, the advice and seek someone else in that instance. So make sure that you do your own research. You can ask the right questions, or if you don't feel comfortable with someone's opinion, seek another opinion and see if there's kind of variance. But I will tell you, most Western medicine doctors are shit, unfortunately, because they just tell you what they learn in school and in clinicals, and again, they don't look at the functionality of it, of how it applies to your life and where you're at. They're like, this is what I learned in school, this is what I do for everyone. If it works, great. If it doesn't, like, tough luck. This is what we do as doctors. So my best advice is look for a naturopathic, holistic doctor who focuses more on functional medicine, that you can ask questions to and they'll give you answers. Any other questions for now?
Let me just say, because I'm in it. But, and so I'm done, but it is exactly everything you're saying. I so appreciate it, and so appreciate your knowledge. But it is so much more possible to find doctors, not regular doctors, like she says, because they will do that. But I mean, it is no longer the F word to say menopause. People are talking about it, and it's just going to get better and better with, what you're doing right now. And you can find people, and you just need to ask, and you need to ask your friends and I can't say your moms, because we all know our moms said nothing about this. Nothing. Maybe you guys, because they're going to start by writing your blood chain.
You're like, no, you're right.
I just thought your mother was going freaking insane at one point, or she was horrible, or whatever, because there wasn't. But now there are so many, I hate to say it, but this is what gets news. They're celebrities, huge people, like Naomi Watts, who has a book out now, and you're saying that, like Oprah, who's in that thing, there's just so many now. So now, what's her name? It doesn't matter. But anyway, this is going to get more open, and then now we're going to have to get through all the crap of what's out there, like knowing, like, oh my God, you can't stick your head in this chamber and then
doctors that are maybe, because I turned 48 today, like that are a few
Happy
years
birthday.
older, maybe a few years older than me, have gone through menopause. So now those doctors that, like, my OBGYN is 35, so she hasn't gone through menopause. She went through whatever they taught her.
Yeah.
But now what I'm finding is I'm looking for the female doctors that have gone through menopause that are now like, oh shit, I didn't learn that in school because it was like one chapter that they learned. And now they care because they now are saying, oh, I see what my patients that have been coming to me since I was 32 are now saying. So now I'm seeking personally doctors that have gone through it so that they are now a little bit more receptive and sympathetic to what is really happening in their own bodies, and they've taken like a new piqued interest in it that they maybe didn't think to take 10 years prior.
No, I completely agree. I mean, like I said, I'm much more of a fan of functional medicine practice. I won't even touch a Western medicine doctor. I'd rather pay out of pocket for someone that knows what they're doing, because doctors who give you bad advice can actually hurt you long term with the advice and the medicine that they put you on. So that's something to consider. And we have to also think about like our kids to come, right? So one of the biggest mistakes you can make as a mom, like I didn't know this and I'm so glad my mom didn't do it, but is putting your teenage girl on birth control to ameliorate some of those symptoms. Those are natural symptoms that will over time balance out with increasing progesterone, but a lot of teenage girls go on birth control and then they stay on it for indefinitely until they're ready to get pregnant. And the problem is you need these fluctuations during your life because you need estrogen for the growth effects that it has, and you need progesterone for the soothing and calming effects that it has on your parasympathetic nervous system, or you're going to have a really hard time during perimenopause. So I think it's important to know these things for like future generations to come and our kids, because that's going to be impactful for them. Yes.
So I'm glad that you brought up the birth control thing, because this was something like when I was a young teenager, like 16 or 18, I got put on birth control because I had terrible periods. They were like worst thing ever, and I was on it for like 16 years or something straight. And then I did have a doctor once who told me, like, because it was like right when I started lifting and I started working out, and the doctor was like, you know, she was like, are you on birth control? How long have you been on it? Because it can actually like permanently affect your hormones and like your ability to even build muscle. Like that's why I went off birth control, because she was like, it could be impacting your ability to build muscle and to get stronger because your hormones are out of whack. And like nobody tells you that. They don't care, they just like throw you on it, you know?
Yeah, and also remember, birth control is synthetic hormones and they do not have the same effect on your body as bioidentical hormones, so there's a really clear distinction. So just again, something to keep in mind for your kids down the line. But yeah, thank you for sharing. I'm just glad my parents didn't put me on it. Alright, okay, so now we're gonna shift into nutrition. Obviously you guys, for the most part, I'm sure all work out, that's why you're here. Because this is a gym, but we're going to talk about nutrition because these are some of the things that may be hard to know, or you don't know because there's a lot of misguided information out there. So we're just going to go back to why the changes in these hormones cause these effects. We'll talk about the mechanism and the science behind it, and then the application of what you can do, obviously to see improvement. So again, all goes back to estrogen. Just remember, all of these things kind of is this perpetual cycle, and they all go back to these fluctuations in estrogen and progesterone. So estrogen again plays a critical role in regulating glucose, right, which is your sugar metabolism, your fat distribution, so again, where you distribute your fat. And one interesting thing that I learned several years ago, like I mentioned to you guys, as women we hold more fat receptors here, etc. And when we start to transition to menopause, a lot of our fat receptors shift to our midsection. So women start to develop male pattern fat distribution. So you might start to see a lot more fat in your midsection as a result of the insulin issues, but also as a result of the shifting of those receptors, and way less, if you guys have seen older women in menopause who struggle with body fat and being overweight, a lot of times they hold a lot more weight here and much less in the back of their arms, thighs, etc., like they used to once upon a time, and that's one of the main reasons. And then again, as estrogen declines, because of its effects on your metabolism, our body becomes less efficient at utilizing glucose, which is also very important. And it leads to insulin resistance, which, like I said, is one of the key factors in prediabetes, diabetes, and hyperinsulinemia. And then talking about progesterone, it exacerbates the stress response because, again, it puts you in that parasympathetic state where you feel calmer because of that soothing effect, which therefore increases your cortisol levels, which can also further promote fat storage, especially visceral fat, so in your midsection. So just to quickly touch on insulin resistance, I think a lot of people still struggle to really understand insulin's role and its effect on your body. So it's the primary characteristic of type 2 diabetes. Basically what happens is every time you eat, your blood sugar spikes, your pancreas releases insulin. Insulin binds to the sugar in your blood and it sends it out to all of the cells in your body. What happens if your blood sugar is constantly elevated, your pancreas continues to shuttle out insulin, your cells become resistant to receiving that glucose. So it's like, kind of think like insulin's constantly knocking on the door and the cells are like, no, I don't want it. So then your pancreas is producing more insulin to try to clear your blood sugar, but it gets to a point where your pancreas stops producing insulin, and that's why Ozempic actually became such a popular drug for diabetes, and I'll touch on that as well. And that's the role of the pancreas. So the pancreas produces more insulin in the beginning to compensate for that resistance, but over time it becomes overwhelmed and then it no longer produces as much insulin as you need. And like I said, that's why Ozempic, which originally was a diabetes drug, now became a weight loss drug. Any questions? Okay, so why insulin levels get out of control, and again, this is talking about perimenopause and menopause. We have a decreased insulin sensitivity, again, going back to estrogen and its effects, and because of those fluctuations, we no longer have that improvement in insulin sensitivity. And then in perimenopause, that reduced estrogen impairs this process, like I said, so it causes blood sugar issues, and blood sugar remains elevated longer after meals, and then your pancreas compensates by producing more insulin, so kind of just tying everything that I mentioned in. And then the weight gain and the fat redistribution, again, insulin is also an anabolic hormone, which is really important to know because it promotes fat storage when it's chronically elevated. So that's why people who are diabetic, typically obesity and diabetes go hand in hand. And during perimenopause, fat tends to shift from subcutaneous, so like I just mentioned, kind of here, to more visceral around your abdomen, which is more metabolically active, and then further exacerbates insulin resistance. So like I said, it's kind of one big vicious cycle. Any questions about insulin?
Okay, so my family history has diabetes on it. I always fluctuate right below the pre-diabetes level. So at this age, I'm fine. But like going into that age where there's less estrogen, how do like people who are prone to diabetes combat that?
So I think although there is somewhat of a genetic component, diabetes is a lot more lifestyle driven. So even if a lot of people in your family have diabetes, I would look more at their lifestyle habits and kind of question that before just assuming that from a pure genetic standpoint, you are also more prone to diabetes. So the things that you can do is exactly what you're doing, resistance training, which is huge as far as improving insulin sensitivity because you're depleting glycogen, right? The amount of carbs stored in your liver and muscle tissue, and therefore the insulin is going to continuously shuttle a lot of that sugar that you're taking in to replenish them. So that's one of the biggest things you can do. Make sure that you always pair your simple carbs, so we're talking about like very sugary things, which I'm sure you probably don't have a lot of, being that you're obviously conscious about what you do here, with either a fat, a protein, or higher fiber, because that slows down digestion, so the rate at which your blood sugar goes up. If you're constantly in the under the pre-diabetic range, I would really focus on those things more than anything, but I wouldn't look at the genetic component as kind of like being your fate, if that makes sense. I think it's, in my opinion, and all the research I've done, mostly lifestyle driven. Yep.
So with the insulin, I've read there's two different viewpoints of, some people say that in order to help those insulin spikes, that intermittent fasting helps, and then other people will say, well, no, actually want to keep it steady, so eating smaller meals in between is better. Do you have a way that you think is better and what you found?
100%. This is something I should have mentioned to you. Fasting is the best possible thing you could do to manage your insulin level. So think every time you eat, and obviously it depends on what you eat, how much of it you eat, but obviously carbs are going to be what spikes your blood sugar the most, hence the name. Every time you eat, you're elevating your insulin. One of the biggest longevity tools that you have in your pocket that literally anyone can do, it's called the poor man's diet, is fasting. Anyone can fast.
Yeah.
So you're no longer spiking. It's the biggest metabolic syndrome issue is those constant spikes in insulin and insulin resistance. So the more you fast and the more you prevent those insulin spikes, the better. So I actually recommend, and I'm not a huge snacker either, and that's one of the main reasons when I learned about this years ago, you want to eat all of your calories in as few meals as possible, also based on your digestion, because the more you spike your insulin, the worse that's going to be for health issues and longevity down the line. So I would recommend bigger meals less often rather than smaller meals more often, and stay away from snacking. I mean, even taking 2 bites of something, you're spiking your blood sugar, depending on what it is, obviously, unless you're eating like a couple almonds. So I would definitely recommend fasting. I think the problem with fasting is that people use it incorrectly as a means to lose weight and cut out bulk calories because they're eating in a limited window. If you're using it as a tool to, you know, give your digestive system a break, manage your blood sugar and insulin, phenomenal.
But would you say like, some people would say like fasting from like 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. is a good amount of time, because most of it, you know, after you've eaten dinner, now you can take a break and just not eat breakfast until, you know, that 12-hour shift? Or do you feel like it has to be even a longer, you like?
Usually it's 14 to 16 hours minimum that would constitute like a fast where you actually see a benefit. Most people actually tend to fast for 10 to 12 hours regardless, because like you mentioned, just kind of their general eating windows. But one thing to note, the minute when you take your last bite, that doesn't mean your fast started. Your fast started when your digestive system actually clears. So that's hours after you've actually finished eating, depending on what you're eating. So the longer you can extend that window, the better. 16-8 is like the most common fasting window. So eat for 8 hours and fast for 16 hours. There's not necessarily like a rhyme or reason nor to say that you have to do that. Some people will do like a 24, they'll fast for 20 hours and, you know, eat in 4 hours. And if you could eat all your calories in that window, great. But again, you have to kind of question like, do I have the digestive capacity to do that, to eat, you know, 2,000, 3,000 calories in 4 hours? And most people don't, right? Hence why that's such a difficult thing to do. One thing that I'm a huge fan of is just doing 24-hour fasts once a week. Kara does it. Because it is very beneficial. It's beneficial for your mental health and clarity. Honestly, you guys, a lot of the food we eat in the US is shit. The best thing I ever did was a 3-day bone broth fast where all I had was bone broth, and although I felt terrible the first day because I was starving, by the 3rd day, the clear-headedness that I had just made me realize how crappy the food we eat is. And I'm from Europe originally, so I've vacationed there a lot with my family. I could eat all the crap in the world there, and I feel like lighter and better than I do here eating normal. It's insane. So the food quality here sucks. So again, like the clear-headedness and the energy levels that you get when you're not eating all this shit is wild. So it's worth a shot. Any other questions? Yes, Patrick.
To that statement, have you found foods that aren't so shitty?
Well, we're going to talk about inflammatory foods. So I actually had some GI issues earlier this year, for example, which I didn't have for years, and now I feel like gluten really makes me feel very like drowsy and tired, which I never had issues with before. I don't know if that's a symptom of me getting older. I don't know if it's a symptom of whatever gut imbalances I had. It's hard to also always trace these things. So now if I have like a ton of it at once, I just feel so sleepy, like my eyes feel heavy. And these are things that I just kind of discovered via experimenting for myself. So I think you kind of have to experiment. We're going to talk about inflammatory foods in general and kind of the role that they play within this as well. But I just think food quality standards in the US are wild. Like if you guys have seen some of these documentaries that are out there now, not just about meat, but about literally everything we eat, it's insane. And the standards in Europe and other parts of the world are so much higher. Yeah.
So if you're gonna do, sorry, I'm going back to fasting. We did it for a little bit. When you work out,
Fasted, like you.
you know, so you just work out fasting.
I don't
Like what
fasted.
time of day would you work out? Like would you work out during your fast, or do you work out when you have obviously the energy?
So I think the type of training you're doing is actually going to be the biggest dictator. So for you, you should be eating, because this kind of training is intense and requires glycogen and blood sugar to be slightly elevated, and you'll perform way better as a byproduct of it. If you're walking or doing some like super light strength training that's not really jacking up your heart rate, you could get away with it fasting, but it does stunt your performance, it stunts your volume. That's why I think about like all these CrossFit athletes that are like, I saw a nutritionist and my scores started soaring. Like there really is is something to it. And the best thing I did, honestly, for, like I said, like, I don't think I'm some spectacular athlete. I think I just have the nutrition part dialed in more than anything. Because it makes a huge difference, right, Claire?
What? Yeah.
Doesn't it make a huge difference?
No, it really does.
Yeah, she's beating me now. I don't
Right? And that's what, like,
Three
two,
times this week.
Yeah.
two, 3 weeks now, and it's already made a huge difference.
Right, and so you can always have.
Yeah, but I would say,
Just to be.
I would say try to eat. I know it's early for you, it's so hard.
I take your carbohydrate.
See, Carbolin, I take your Carbolin. Yeah, so you could also do, like, I do an intro workout drink called Carbolin, which is basically just a carb form of sugar, essentially, that I'm drinking. And because your glycogen is getting depleted so quickly, it's replenishing what you're depleting, so therefore it increases your performance because the sustained rate of effort, whereas we crash super fast. You can only store, I want to say, like 40 or 50 grams of carbs, something along those lines in your liver, and another small amount in your muscle tissue. So with workouts like this, it gets tapped into really fast. So if you're fasted, think about, if you're fasted for a 6 a.m. workout, you've also been fasted for the last 8 to 10 hours. And remember, some of that glycogen that you have stored is also being utilized at that time for everything that goes on while you're sleeping. So you have very low amounts of glycogen to work with for an early workout. So for a workout like this, it's very beneficial to eat.
What do you recommend, like, in the morning? Because I typically work out at 8 in the morning and I fast till like 12, 1 sometimes, and then that's when I kind of have my meal, and then I have my lunch and my dinner.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know, I just find it hard to eat before I work out.
A lot of that is also conditioning, I will say. Like, your body will always adapt to what you do. So if you're someone that always eats breakfast, you're gonna be starving if you skip breakfast. If you're someone that always skips breakfast, it's really hard to get yourself to eat breakfast. So a lot of that is conditioning. So what I always recommend is start trying to eat small amounts in the morning. Like, if you now start eating at 12, try to eat at 11, try to eat at 10, or maybe just eat earlier on the days that you work out and do your fast on the days that you don't, because of the benefits that it has otherwise. But as far as if we're talking about energy for workouts like this, think carbs and fats. Carbs are shorter, more immediate bursts. Fats are more delayed kind of performance. If you're doing like a longer run or something like that, you can benefit from doing some fats with your carbs. But I would definitely say try like something like a banana. You know, you could start super small. It's 20 to 25 grams of carbs. You could even like blend it, you know, with some almond milk if you feel that you don't want something actually sitting in your stomach. And a big component to that is also going to be someone's digestion. If your digestion is great, you could probably eat something and not have any issues. If you have, let's say, like if you wake up at 6 a.m. and you have a 2-hour window leading up to your workout, maybe try a banana at like 6:30 a.m. and see how that goes, and maybe try 7 a.m. and then 7:30 a.m., something along those lines. If you, let's say, work out at like noon and you can have breakfast at 9:30, great, have a full meal, because that's more than enough time to digest the food. And then you could have something smaller like right before. So I do Carbolin and dried figs, and I probably eat like 600, 700 calories of just carbs, like on my way to my workout. And I just found that that works for me, right? So everybody has something different that works for them. Anyone else have questions?
So you'll stop eating earlier instead of fasting the other way around in the morning?
Yeah, exactly. And you don't have to fast every day unless you're kind of like glued to the idea of it. Most people prefer fasting early in the mornings, and that's always the trade-off, right? It's like if you have an early workout, you should eat something, but it's way easier to fast in the morning because you can fast it overnight. So like you're like 10 hours strong. I can easily do 4 more hours. Plus coffee is a good appetite suppressant, so it makes it easier. It's so much harder to fast into the evening. And carbs, glycogen actually bring down cortisol levels. So a lot of time if you don't eat like leading up to sleep, depending on what that window is for you, you might have an issue falling asleep as a byproduct. So all these things are kind of factors to consider. But I would say just try to eat something on your workout days and see if it helps your performance and if you feel better. And it also depends on how hard you push yourself, right? So it could be a hard workout, but obviously even within CrossFit, we could choose how hard we push ourselves during that workout.
How much time do we give ourselves between eating? Like 30 minutes?
Again, it depends on your digestion. So like I said, I'm literally shoveling in the car, leaving my house at 12 to get here at 12:15 late every day, and just eating in the car. So it depends on you. But like I can't eat a bowl of oatmeal, you know what I mean? I'm eating simple sugars that are super quick to digest.
You're not getting full.
No, because I wouldn't want it to feel like it's sitting in my stomach. Yeah, so it really depends on someone's digestion. Patrick used to eat a bowl of oatmeal driving to the gym, like a boulder sitting in your stomach, but his digestion works great. Alright, any other questions for now? Okay, so we're just gonna quickly shift into cortisol again. I think it's really important to just kind of understand stress, to understand the effects of all of these hormones, the effects that they have on you, and how they're being affected by these fluctuations in estrogen and progesterone, because the more you know, the easier it's gonna be to apply strategies to mitigate this. I'm sure you guys have all heard the word cortisol, right? So it's your stress response hormone. It's released by your adrenal glands. So cortisol is very beneficial acutely. So it's kind of the example you've always heard, like if you see a tiger in the woods, your body's gonna release a ton of cortisol to raise your adrenaline to be like, run as fast as you possibly can. But if your body is constantly producing cortisol, it's the same as what I mentioned regarding your pancreas. If your adrenals are constantly producing cortisol, it starts to slow down production of other hormones like DHEA, for example, which is why DHEA on your blood work is a great indicator of high cortisol levels. Because your adrenal glands get to a point where they're producing so much cortisol, they slow down or stop the production of the other hormones that they're producing. So chronic elevated cortisol levels become problematic for that reason, although cortisol acutely is very beneficial and important. If our workouts, we increase cortisol levels. Cold plunges, you increase cortisol levels. Fasting, you increase cortisol levels. That's why it's hard to sleep sometimes if you fast for 24 hours into the night. So all things to kind of factor in. So like I said, the hormonal imbalances with progesterone going down is going to naturally increase the stress level neurologically, and elevated cortisol levels raise blood sugar levels, which causes more problems as far as insulin regulation goes and causes metabolic dysfunction, and then creates systemic inflammation. So basically think holding on more water systemically throughout your body, which is why you might feel puffier in general, or your weight might go up on the scale. And that's why we can have such drastic fluctuations in weight. I have, clients sometimes that will gain 3, 4, 5 pounds in the course of a week. Their nutrition was perfect, but maybe like their sleep was shit. Or they're super sore from a workout, right? Soreness, again, you're holding water. So these are all things to factor in. And stress can present itself in many ways, and this is what I try to explain to someone. Just because you don't feel stressed doesn't mean something's not a stressor on your body, right? So the best way that I could explain it, and I think this kind of makes sense as an analogy, think that you have this bucket of stress, and your body can only tolerate so much. So every stressor in your life, training, under eating, relationship stress, financial stress, fucking political stress, like whatever you want to think about, these are all different water bottles that you're pouring into this bucket. This bucket can only hold so much. So once this bucket starts to overflow, you start having issues from elevated cortisol levels. So the best thing you could do is think, what are the stressors that I could pull away in my life, the ones that I can control, right? Like, you can't control being a parent. Having kids is hard. You can't control the nature of your job sometimes. That's hard. But let's say you're not sleeping enough because you're staying up to be on social media or watch TV. Like, that's something you can control. Let's say you're in a super severe caloric deficit because you're trying to lose weight super fast. That's something you can control, right? Like, think about the things that you can control. That's the important part. And then just kind of tying in, just so that you understand what metabolic dysfunction is, like I said, so it's obviously impaired metabolism, whether it be due to insulin resistance, whether it be due to other hormonal fluctuations, thyroid issues. We won't get into it too much, but obviously just so that you kind of understand how these things correlate. Okay, and now kind of jumping into what I said earlier about muscle mass loss over time. So this is referred to as sarcopenia, and it's not something that, again, we can fully prevent, but we can slow it down based on training, eating enough protein, working on our recovery. So although we can't stop it altogether, we can minimize it. And again, this is talking about natural conditions, not taking anything exogenously. So after age 30, which I think is almost everyone here, we lose 3 to 8% of muscle mass per decade due to natural decline in anabolic hormones, estrogen for women, testosterone for men, obviously to some degree a little bit of that for both sexes. And reduced physical activity. Like, a lot of people stop moving when they get older, whether because they're tired, and remember, that's also a vicious cycle. It's like the less you do, the more tired you are, the less you want to do, right? So it kind of all ties in, and it becomes a cycle. Once you hit 50, that rate accelerates to 1 to 2% per year, obviously a lot more drastic, so looking at 10 to 20% over a decade. And again, it's referred to as sarcopenia, more after 50 than it is at the age of 30. And then after age 60, your muscle strength declines a lot more rapidly. That's why people suffer a lot more falls and fractures and things like that at about 3% per year, which can lead to the decreased functionality and increased risk of falls. That's why training is so important, because it can help us prevent that. Okay, so just really quick to again kind of go back to what I said on tying everything back in on the nutrition side. No matter what you're going through, no matter how stressed you are, no matter what hormonal irregularities you have, all it's doing is making this equation inefficient. All of us as humans, this equation is still the main reason as to why we lose or we gain weight if we're talking about pure body mass, not water fluctuation. So again, calories in is anything that we consume that contains calories, food or drink, just to keep it simple. And then calories out is made up of 4 parts: BMR, basal metabolic rate, and this is the part that suffers as we get older from that decline in muscle mass, right? Because muscle requires more energy to sustain. The more muscle tissue you have, the more you can eat to sustain said muscle. EAT, again, stands for exercise activity thermogenesis, so anything that you do that's training specific, right? Like working out, playing a sport, etc. NEAT is non-exercise activity thermogenesis. That's why so many people do step counts, because it's a tangible way to track your movement. Again, anything that you do, you could be vacuuming, you could be brushing your dog, you could be washing the dishes, but you can't track that type of movement. So that's why people do step counts to track how much they move outside of their workouts. And then thermic effect of food is what TEF is. So this is what makes, obviously, weight gain or weight loss happen. And like I said, hormonal changes, all it does is it makes this equation inefficient. So as another example, let's say you have a thyroid issue. Your TSH is jacked up and you're not producing as much T4 or T3. What that does is it makes your expenditure, let's say 20 to 25% lower because of that thyroid issue. So it's not to say this equation no longer works, it's now that your BMR is so much lower because you have a thyroid problem, hence you now have to eat less or move more to compensate for that, right? So it's always a matter of how do you shift that equation in a way that makes sense for yourself. Some people choose to eat less, some people choose to eat more, it depends what you prefer and what you have time for. And then what are the things that we can control, like I said, to make this equation more beneficial? So we could increase our training. Again, like I said, go back to this. We could increase our training and the style of training we do. We can walk more, we can sleep more so we can recover better and have more energy to push harder on our workouts, have more energy to walk more, move more. We can eat higher quality foods to increase the thermic effect of food. We can put on more muscle or try to sustain the muscle mass that we have to keep our BMR high. We could look into hormone replacement or supplements to kind of help some of those imbalances. So there's still a lot of things that you could do. And then just gonna kind of get into the slightly last part here. So this is a really big topic of conversation. Again, kind of falling into this window of perimenopause and menopause and why inflammatory foods are so problematic at this age. And again, it all kind of ties back into the role of estrogen and progesterone. So these are the main inflammatory food groups, basically a lot of just like processed stuff, but gluten, dairy, and soy are the big ones. And then heavily processed foods and refined sugars. And I will explain why this is important. So again, because of declining estrogen levels, obviously you get the idea, this is kind of the crux of everything. During perimenopause and menopause, increases systemic inflammation and it worsens symptoms like joint pain, fatigue, mood swings, and weight gain, right? So due to the estrogen alone, you're already starting to feel these symptoms. These specific foods actually worsen these symptoms, which is why it's really important to obviously cut down on the amount that you're eating, eliminate altogether, kind of depends on you obviously and your preferences. But inflammatory foods worsen these issues for some of these reasons. So they trigger gut imbalances, insulin resistance, and chronic inflammation. So you're already dealing with these things, and again, they're just being exacerbated by these foods. And it interferes with hormone metabolism, which can cause more hot flashes, a lot of bloating, joint pain, brain fog. So you see how all of these things are interconnected. So dairy, soy, and gluten are the 3 that are mainly recommended to cut out. And a lot of my clients that I've worked with, once we start to make those changes, they already feel a world of difference just from that alone, let alone obviously the changes nutritionally that you can make over time, increased training, all of that. But just so you guys understand the importance behind it, so it's not just because they're quote unquote bad for you, it's important to understand their effects and why it's important to cut them out during this time if you are feeling those symptoms. And don't get me wrong, some women are completely asymptomatic during this time. So it's not like this is everyone, it's just obviously alluding to the women who are going through these issues. It could also cause like skin rashes, breakouts, eczema, things like that, right? A lot of joint pain and muscle pain, especially gluten. So just something to keep in mind. So then kind of tying it all in on the nutrition front, these are some of the other things that you can do. Adequate protein intake. So a lot of women really struggle with eating protein, men too, but women primarily. I would recommend to eat at least 0.8 grams per pound of body weight, current body weight, or 1 gram per pound of desired body weight or lean tissue. So like if you've done a DEXA scan and you know you have 120 pounds of lean mass, try to eat at least 120 grams of protein as an example. You don't necessarily need to go above 1 gram per pound, especially if you're fairly lean, just because you maximize what's called muscle protein synthesis, your ability to put on muscle at that. So it's like anything beyond that's just not really necessary. You might as well allocate it to another macro that has more of a benefit. Higher levels of omega-3s and high quality fats, and again, this is to also help manage cholesterol, which can become problematic as we get older, and your triglycerides for heart disease issues. So if you could take a fish oil supplement, because a lot of people just can't eat enough fish, obviously, to hit those levels. You could increase your fiber intake. This is a really big one, both for gut health and cholesterol levels. So cholesterol actually, fiber binds to cholesterol to excrete it out of the body. So one of the main recommendations for higher than ideal cholesterol levels is just to increase your fiber intake. Anywhere in the range of 25 plus is great, and that could also depend on your digestion. So I would say like 25 to 35 to 40 for women, somewhere around like 40 to 50 grams for men. And we're not talking about like psyllium husk, like actual fiber from fruits, veggies. Avoid snacking, like we talked about, right, to manage your blood sugar and insulin levels. So I would say do 3 to 4 bigger meals per day rather than like 6 or 7 smaller meals or snacks. So that was a good question. You could pair your high glycemic carbs, like we talked about, Mona, simple sugars with protein, fiber, and fat, because it's going to help manage those blood sugar spikes and it slows down your digestion, which can help with insulin sensitivity. And then honestly, avoid yo-yo dieting and severe caloric deficits because it's a huge stressor on the body, like I said. So if you are looking to lose weight, try to create and maintain a controlled deficit, somewhere in the ballpark of, let's say, like half a pound to a pound per week, 2 to 4 pounds per month. It doesn't sound like a lot, but depending on how much weight you have to lose, if, you know, in the course of 6 months, you've lost like 12 to 20 pounds, that's pretty drastic, right? So think longer term. And the best way that I can explain this to people, and I did this test with my kids, Brittany, I don't know if you've ever done it, the delayed gratification test, where I gave them each a cookie and I told them that if they can wait until I get back in the room and I left for like 3 or 4 minutes, I'll give them 2 cookies, and we were just watching them. And they actually didn't touch the cookie because they wanted the delayed gratification and they waited for getting 2 cookies instead. So if a 2-year-old can do it, I feel like adults can do it. But understanding that if you can work to, let's say, like reverse diet or manage your intake, push to a higher maintenance, etc., do all the things that you need to do in the short term to set yourself up for success in the long term. Again, it's harder because you have to wait, but that delayed gratification that you'll get from doing it sustainably is much higher and much more rewarding. And then talking about supplements, because I typically get a lot of questions about this. So my take on supplements is supplement something that you're either deficient in or that's helping mitigate an issue that you're having. Supplements for the sake of supplements are just not necessary. Not to say they can harm you, some can, but you're honestly just wasting your money. So these are the 3 supplements that I think all women can benefit from, regardless of age or, you know, kind of symptoms in general. Vitamin D, it's somewhere around 70% of the population that has low vitamin D levels. Even in a place like Southern California, like my levels are super low, so I'm on vitamin D replacement. I feel like almost everyone I know. If you're having energy level issues or anything like that, definitely look into your vitamin D because it might be low. Like I said, regardless if you live in a sunny climate or not. And fun fact, pair your vitamin D with the fat because it absorbs better. And then omega-3s, like I mentioned earlier, just because it's hard to get enough from the food that you're eating. And then magnesium, there's a lot of magnesiums, but threonate or glycinate actually help a lot with muscle recovery, sleep quality, and it's something that gets depleted in times of stress, so you can never really overdose magnesium. It's one of the most recommended supplements for perimenopause also. Protein powder, again, you know, I don't even really take a protein powder. I feel like I get enough from the food I eat, so just keep thinking about it as a supplement. Like, only take it if you feel like it's hard for you to get enough from the food that you're eating, is my take on it at least. And I would say do a plant-based protein if you're doing protein, just because whey, soy, obviously we're trying to avoid dairy and soy, so it's a lot easier on your gut. And for a lot of people causes bloating, rashes. Also dairy can increase mucus secretions, so just something to consider. And then liver support supplement, maybe every like quarter or 6 months. It's a really good idea because our livers just get overburdened again from the amount of shit in our environment and the food that we eat. So it's good for everyone to do a liver support like once or twice a year. Berberine, I would highly suggest in Mona. This is something that you could look into for blood sugar support. So it's kind of like nature's metformin, basically. It's a blood sugar clearing agent, and it's an herbal supplement. It's also an antimicrobial, and it helps lower cholesterol levels. It's a phenomenal supplement. Definitely look into it if you have any blood sugar issues, cholesterol issues, or gut issues. It's something that you don't want to take for an extensive duration of time though, because it is an antimicrobial, so it could shift your gut microbiome. So do it for a short term, take a break, do it for a short term, take a break, and so on. But it can also help with cravings. When I was taking berberine, it's like I was hungry for food, but I didn't really care what I was eating, if that makes sense. Like it really helps manage your blood sugar in a crazy way. Adrenal and thyroid support are also really good. And again, this is all supplements, not medication, right? So just because of the stress levels on our body, and then, you know, thyroid. So a lot of women will have impaired thyroid function as they get older, whether it's due to genetics, whether it's due to lifestyle, whether it's due to pure stress. Like I feel like my life has gotten more stressful as I've gotten older. I don't know about you guys, but it's hard to completely eliminate stress in life, so our thyroids do suffer from that. So doing a thyroid support, not thyroid replacement, can be very beneficial. And then zinc and glutamine are also super beneficial for gut health. So these are just kind of some hormones like off the top of my head that I think most people can benefit from if you kind of fall into one of the categories where you're symptomatic to some degree or feel like you need it. You guys have any questions? Yes.
This might be a dumb question, but
Never any
your
dumb
thoughts
questions.
on protein powder versus protein bars, because I don't know why I like to enjoy eating something and drinking protein powder. I don't like it as much, or maybe I haven't found the right one.
Mm-hmm.
But like, what are your thoughts on those?
Protein is protein, honestly. As long as it's a complete protein, the actual source of protein doesn't really matter that much. So whether it's a bar or a protein powder, it's still a supplement regardless, right? Because it's not coming from whole foods. The reason why most people will do protein is just because it's easier. It's like, let's say you want to do protein post-workout. Nobody wants to eat a chicken breast. Like, it's way better to drink like a chocolate shake or eat a protein bar. So it's more of a convenience thing. Ultimately, the other benefit is that it's already a broken down form of protein. Hence, it's a little less taxing on your digestive system. But then you have to kind of Mom's always got the stuff. You also have to factor in the trade-off that it's not just protein in that bar. There's a lot of other ingredients which could be problematic for gut health issues or for some of the things that I mentioned. So it's one of there's way more clean bars now that will have like 4 or 5 ingredients versus like 30. So I'd say do a plant-based bar like RX bars. If you like dates, they're super chewy. Go macro bars, aloha bars. Like there's so many bars out there. So it doesn't matter if it's a bar, if it's a shake. Like I said, my recommendation is always do as much as you can from the food that you're eating versus supplements. But if it's in a bind, if you need it as a snack, or if you just enjoy it, just find one that's really clean.
The aloha ones are really good, and my partner's used to know that. Like, don't eat those, they're mine.
Yeah.
The aloha bars.
Go ahead.
Yeah, they're really good.
I have a question about dairy and obviously trying to avoid anything inflammatory, but is there within dairy like are there levels of dairy that are like better versus like eating like a Greek yogurt as an easy like high protein meal?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, or cheese, like a low fat cheese, cottage cheese. Like I'm just curious.
So again, it comes down to the quality of the dairy. So if you were eating dairy in Europe, you'd probably have no problems. It's the quality of the way that the food is processed here. So it's actually, I think it's A2 casein, I want to say, that's within specific dairy products that causes the inflammatory response. And I think butter and cream are the only 2 dairy products that actually don't have that A2 casein or don't have enough of it to be as problematic. But you could typically do goat or sheep products, which actually have different enzymes, so are a lot easier on your body if you really are craving dairy. That's usually the best recommendation, honestly. But you can also play it by ear. Like if you have some dairy and you're like, I feel totally fine with having like a small cup of yogurt, no negative side effects. And like I said, it could be bloating, it could be bowel movement issues and gas. It could be mucus secretions, like if you feel super mucusy, if it could be acid reflux. It's not just like bloating, that's an issue from dairy. And it could also be how it affects these hormonal imbalances too. So I would say eat a small amount. If you feel good with it and it's giving you no problems, keep with it. If you're like, I'm starting to feel like something's off, it's probably not worth it, then maybe try a replacement. And honestly, we're so lucky now, 2025, like there's replacements for literally anything. There's a coconut variant, an almond variant, a gluten-free variant, like you get anything you want now. Yes, Brittany.
So this is like perimenopause. Would you recommend decreasing like soy, dairy, and gluten post-menopause too? Like if like my patients come in with like joint pains, right? Post-menopause as well. Same idea?
Especially gluten, yeah. So gluten is really notorious for joint issues. And then remember, there's different types of gluten. So there could be celiacs, which is like kind of like your highest autoimmune. There's gluten intolerance, there's gluten sensitivity, and there's specific types of gluten that someone can find problematic. And again, it depends what country you're into, right? It's like also wild. But there's different levels of gluten issues. You could have some symptoms, but not all. You could be completely asymptomatic, and it could kind of trickle down the line. So I think for women in general, especially for most, like I said, like functional health practitioners now, and sports nutrition science people, they just said just cut gluten altogether because it's your best bet. And again, it's not something like you can never have gluten again. It's just have it, on occasion. Like if it's your birthday, have some cake. If you're going out to dinner, have a pizza. It's not to say never have it again, because I think restriction is also not good mentally. So if you feel like you're generally asymptomatic and you could have some, great, but I think as a recommendation, talking more about health, longevity, and balance over time, it's probably best to just cut it all together. Yeah.
I also was curious about magnesium, and is it only effective like if you take it like orally, or is there any effectiveness for like taking like a bath and adding like magnesium?
I don't, it's for baths. I know there's also like sprays you could put on topically, and I don't really know the difference between absorption rates. I think orally is the best recommendation as far as highest bioavailability. You can also do shots if you're really low in magnesium levels, which is highest bioavailability. But I think magnesium pills is like most accessible to most people and most likely for continuity, because most people aren't going to take a magnesium bath daily, so therefore it might not be as beneficial and something you can do, ongoing. Yes, Patrick?
Okay. I feel like I had two statements to that question. First, the question is, my brain is gone. First question is, for the everyday athlete, female athlete, after all the information that you've given them and us, is there a recommended place to start for somebody who's looking to kind of like, you were like, test your stress, like eliminate stress, watch these foods, girl, they're inflammatory, you know what I'm saying? Like, as you're battling them off, is there a specific place or like a good starting point? Because like addressing all of it at one time sounds stressful in and of itself. But like, is there a good place that you recommend? Like, hey, this is an easy, quick, like a low-hanging fruit that you can address?
It depends, because everyone's so different in what they need and where they're at, and like their journey or their age is so subjective. So I am always more of a fan of like respond to symptoms, or just be generally proactive instead of retroactive. Like if you're like, okay, I'm 39, right, Kim, 41, I don't know if I'm in perimenopause yet, but I know I'm gonna get there in the next 1 to 5 years. What are the small things that I could start doing now to make sure that I'm as well set up for that time? I think most women, even the ones that have the knowledge, wait to be retroactive. Like, we don't respond until we have a, we talk about like stretching or injuries. Like, I don't do shit, my warm-ups are 5 minutes, but if I'm injured, I'm like, okay, I need to stretch and do X, Y, Z, and like wear a splint for my wrist now. I would have never thought to do that before. So most of us think very retroactively, and we respond to, like issues, like I said, which I think is fine, but if you can be proactive and start to say like, okay, I wouldn't dive right in supplements, because one thing I told Kara as well is like, supplements can't replace lifestyle. So if you're gonna make an immediate change, what are the easiest things that you could change? And I would say it always is gonna come down to nutrition. Like, you could train your ass off, but if you're not eating properly to complement where you're at with your life and your goals, it doesn't matter how much you're training. So if we're talking about low-hanging fruit, it's gonna be nutrition.
Gotcha. The statement that I wanted to say was to her, Ninja Creamies. Baby, we,
Oh my God.
I went to her house and then I grabbed her, and then when I tell you that she needs protein powder, almond milk, you let it freeze overnight, you sow it, it
cream every night. It's great. You can put whatever you want in it.
It's just protein. I'm not bullshitting you.
If there's one takeaway from being here today, it's get a Ninja Creamy.
It's super fat.
Yeah?
It's fat, and you know what's going on.
Let's get like
Oh no, it's
Yeah, it's like you're eating like a kind of ice cream.
My last thing is like outside, as an outsider, as a man, being in, like looking in, and I guess like being in, I think it's really important like that everybody like keep these conversations at the forefront, like keep the taboo shit at the forefront, talking about menopause, periods, and symptoms of that nature. Like, you know how like when like you ask your friend, like, oh girl, do you have a tampon? Like you say it low.
Yeah, you whisper, and then you try to hide it behind your
Like, as these conversations come to the forefront, like you do want doctors to learn more about this shit. You do want like it's a shame that like we have to say like, well, find the right doctor. Like, what the hell do you mean? You went through a decade of school. What do you mean the right doctor? Like, girl, do you not know about this or not?
Well, most of the medical research too is on males, right? So
Yeah, and that's so hard. It's so frustrating.
Yes.
Because women are too unpredictable.
Right. Yeah. So emotional.
Which one?
Stupid.
I could recommend it now.
yeah.
But yeah, keep these conversations at the forefront. Like, say it loudly, speak often.
you too, and you too.
Oh, down.
Patrick is the biggest female advocate there is.
I tell my husband that all the time.
I recommend any male trainer at all or any form of physician, if you can't, there are some things that I will like randomly rattle off, and if you can't answer them, I think you don't need to be coaching or speaking to it. Like, not, like, I'm serious, like if you don't know whether or not a tampon is to come out for a woman to use the restroom, I'm sorry, brother.
Brother.
No, if you got it, you should shut up and read book. But yeah, I think it's really important to like keep the conversation at the forefront and not just at a seminar. Like talk to daughters, talk to your girls at brunch, like all of it. Keep it at the forefront because it's gonna happen.
Yeah.
She's not.
Yeah, and like I said, one of the main reasons why I'm happy that I started learning about this and understand it is like for my kids, you know, like I want to set my daughter up for the future to be successful, especially with all the pressure of like social media and what it is these days. Like anything we can do as parents to help them from a health perspective is huge.
Speaking of social media, where can we find you? Oh my god, you're so smart. I have to follow you.
I'll put it up after. Thank you. Go ahead.
On your supplements, I've taken various supplements, including vitamin D and zinc and magnesium. And I'm curious to know if you feel there's certain times of day that certain supplements are better. Like if I take magnesium at night, that's better than if I try to take it in the morning. Like there's different times of day, so I'm just curious if you found that there's certain times of day that certain supplements are better for you, like they make you more sleepy or they give you a little energy that you don't want right before you go to bed or stuff like that.
Not in this particular list. I do agree with you that magnesium at night for sleep reasons. I personally never feel like it like helps me with sleep that much, but I guess, you know, I've heard a mixed bag of opinions, and that's one of its main benefits is being soothing on your body, so that makes sense. I think the only other one I could think of here is like berberine, for example. Like you would never want to take berberine without eating a meal and one that contains carbs because you could go very hypoglycemic, which would be problematic. But other than that, I mean, maybe like protein powder post-workout, like I said, just 'cause it's a more convenient way to get something in, but there's no such thing as an anabolic window, so I guess that doesn't matter either. I honestly just go based on what it says on the bottle for most of them. I think on this list, magnesium is the only one that I could think of that it makes most sense to take in the evening. Yep.
So you were saying before to avoiding processed foods. Everybody always talks about like processed foods, and I was curious what you would consider to be a processed food. Like obviously something like McDonald's chicken nugget is a processed food, but I know I've heard people even say things like frozen chicken from the grocery store, calling it a processed
Everything is processed. I mean, rice is processed, broccoli is like everything is processed. It just depends, is it minimally or heavily processed? Anything that you take out of its original state is processed, basically. The thing that you're looking for is the ingredients that cause the effects that we talked about. It's more about those specific ingredients more than anything. So that's why there's such a big push now for minimal ingredients in the foods that we're eating, and that's what I would encourage you to look at. Look at the ingredients. Like if there's like 8 to 10 or less and you know what they all are, great. If there's a ton of like this syrup and that coloring and etc., probably not one. And I I mean, I think we're all like smart enough now to know what's like heavily processed. Like if you're eating waffles and like yogurt every day, super processed, right? But I think a lot of this also goes to a lot of the trans fat containing foods, like all the things our parents ate that they didn't know any better. And again, I think we're lucky that we have such a big shift now into higher quality food that's so easily accessible and sometimes not even as expensive. Like we do all our shopping at Trader Joe's because I feel like it's that perfect balance of like, it's not nearly as expensive as a Whole Foods or Sprouts. I feel like I buy 7 things at Whole Foods and it's like $150. But it's also like higher quality than, let's say, if I'm shopping like a food for less. So it just, I would say just look at the ingredients more than anything. But if you could just focus on cutting out gluten, dairy, and soy, that's like already a huge start. Yeah.
It really does. I also learned that soy is in fucking everything.
Yeah,
Everything has fucking soy
and it's an emulsifier. So yeah, stay away from emulsifiers. And again, that's the effect that it has on your gut microbiome. So remember, all these things in isolation aren't the issue. It's the combination and how they affect, again, hormonal balance, gut health, your adrenals, your sleep quality. Like even talking about alcohol, and that's not one that I touched on here, but everybody thinks that alcohol is bad because of the calories. The calories don't fucking matter. It's the effects of alcohol as a toxin that affects your sleep, that affects your liver, that affects your gut health. It's the effects of alcohol itself, not the calories that come with the alcohol. And again, we're trying to eliminate stressors on our body. Alcohol is a huge stressor, right? So you have to kind of think of that outside effect that it's having. Okay, I think this is the last thing. So bioidentical hormone replacement, I am all about it. I'm on the bandwagon. When I get to that age, I'm totally taking it because and again, do your own research, right? Ultimately take everything with a grain of salt. But bioidentical hormone replacement is much different than synthetic hormones, like the hormones that like, some women in more of like our mom's age group died from for various reasons or had issues with, or there's class action lawsuits against. So hormone replacement has come a long way, and I think that what it's doing is it's filling a hole of what your body originally produced that it can't produce anymore to put you in a more optimal state, right? So if you have, let's say, like a history of stroke, there are genetic medical components in which case you'd want to avoid hormone replacement. And again, find a good doctor, because not all doctors will tell you this, but if you have a history of stroke in your family, cancer, etc., you should definitely talk to your doctor, do your own research. They can minimally increase that risk, but then it's kind of the trade-off for yourself. Like if I know I have a history of breast cancer in my family, I'm probably not going to do hormone replacement. My mom's mom, my grandma died of a stroke, so my mom can't do hormone replacement. Luckily, I'm a generation removed, so that's typically fine. So she has to do more natural, kind of like herbal supplements, things like that. So it's something to consider, right? If you want to be in a more optimal state, I think it's worth looking into, because all it does is it fills that hole of something your body once produced that it can no longer produce. Some people are very anti-supplements, anti-medicine, anti-whatever, and that's totally fine. Like you could always seek more holistic solutions, but I would say it's always worth looking into, especially progesterone, as you kind of get to your 40s and you start to feel the shorter cycles, the sleep disturbances, the lower energy, the inflammation, the higher stress levels and mood swings. You could do topical, which is very low dose, like very gentle curb. Your doctor could talk to you about, like oral tablets, higher dose, much steeper curb. So I would say just do your own research on it, but I think it's definitely worth looking into and kind of knowing when the right timing is. Because like I said, you don't want to take estrogen on the front end of the perimenopause, but you could heavily benefit on the back end and leading into menopause. So all things to kind of consider. Any questions?
So like perimenopause time, do you usually have like heavy bleeding or is it light bleeding?
It tends to be more heavy, but again, remember, every woman is different. So all the symptoms can totally vary, and there could be women that are completely asymptomatic, and I've heard some women say like, I breezed through it, I hit menopause, and I was super happy and never had an issue. And I've heard plenty of women say they had terrible issues, but it tends to be more heavy bleeding, because like I said, it's like second puberty where you have the fluctuating estrogen with no progesterone to offset the effects. So heavier bleeding, shorter cycles at first, longer cycles towards the tail end. But yeah, typically heavier and more painful.
Okay, so my mom went through that thing. She went straight to a hysterectomy because she was just bleeding every single day all the time. So would something like that be helpful during that time?
It might have potentially, but like unfortunately, like she might have not had access, let's say, to these resources at that time. And it depends what doctor she worked with. Some doctors would be like, hey, we're gonna do a hysterectomy, or some doctors might have been like, hey, we're just gonna put you on birth control, because that way we could just negate all symptoms altogether, you'll just sail into menopause, which is not what happens. So it probably just depends on her medical practitioner. You could also have issues with like endometriosis that we didn't talk about, PCOS, fibroids. There's obviously a lot of other things that are factors, and the reason why some women do choose to get a hysterectomy or partial hysterectomy. So I think that's going to be like a more case by case basis for sure. Yeah.
If you're on birth control, how does that affect?
So the problem with birth control, remember, birth control suppresses your natural hormone production. So you're no longer producing estrogen or progesterone. Some of them you can still ovulate on and still produce progesterone, I think especially with like an IUD. But again, it's like always the trade-off, right, of like what's most important to you. So if you're like, absolutely need birth control because I cannot afford to have a child, then just make sure you choose like the best birth control for you based on like managing the amounts of the actual hormone that comes in it, and kind of do your own research. Like, I think read Reddit threads, you know what I mean? Like, hear other people's stories. That's the first thing I always do, is like, what are the effects of X, especially now with ChatGPT. But I'll read like Reddit threads and stuff. I want to know worst case scenario. And how often does it happen? If there's a ton of negative comments, I'm not touching that, whatever that may be, you know? So that would be my suggestion. But also, you know, if you're at a place where like you've been on birth control just because that's what you've done your whole life and that's all you've known, you might want to consider slowly coming off of it, because the production of those hormones is going to be super important for that transition for all the reasons that I mentioned. Any other questions about this specifically? No? Okay, so last thing as far as lifestyle recommendations, obviously we've kind of touched on these. I'll just put them all up here. But increase your expenditure, like move as much as you can. That's the whole point of, like I said, like a step count, park further, walk up the stairs. Like, your workouts alone are not enough. Most people's workouts, like general population workouts, you're looking at like 200-300, maybe 400 calories. That's not a huge component of your daily expenditure. So best thing you could do is just move, and move in a way that's in a low stress state, right? So walking is very minimally impactful on our body. It's not gonna elevate our cortisol levels. It's gonna improve our insulin sensitivity and blood sugar management. It's gonna improve our sleep quality, and it's gonna improve our mood. So try to just move as best as possible. Like, again, it's like the poor man's training. You know, anyone can walk, hike, like do what you can do, dance, do anything, but just try to move as much as possible, because the more you can increase that need category, and that's where people fall short on weight loss. They think their workouts are just like, I'm working out 5 days a week and I'm not losing weight. Like, what the heck? If you're not doing anything else and you're walking 1,000 to 2,000 steps, you're very minimally active. And like I said, in my experience, most general population workouts are so minimally, such a minimal caloric expenditure. So we're not using our workouts necessarily to get our expenditure to soar. We're using it for the other benefits, right? Of like our physique, our muscle building, again, the insulin sensitivity, things like that. But you're not necessarily using your workouts to cut a huge chunk of calories. So try to move as much as you can. Manage your stress levels. I think this is the one thing that's overlooked, and I'm sure all of you can kind of attest to this, but mental health is like of zero importance, and everybody places all their emphasis on physical health. And yes, physical health is very important, but just know that your physical health is often also controlled by your mental health. So if your mental health is not in a good place, chances are everything else in your life is going to fall by the wayside. I'm sure some of you have gone through it. We've all had tough periods in our life. So honestly, anything that you could do to manage stress levels, it doesn't have to be meditation. It could be just put your phone away. Like, the best thing I did was delete my Instagram. I was almost like programmed for days after to just open my phone and just like click where my app was for days after, because I'm so conditioned to do it. And I realized I'm just not getting a benefit from it. So, little things that you can do to focus on you more. I talked to Brittany about this. I started doing a puzzle, which like I feel for me is so great. Like, it's very relaxing. I'm just by myself. I don't have to do it fast. I don't have to do it slow. It's not like something I have to commit to. I just enjoy doing it. Like, anything you enjoy doing for yourself, do it, because it'll help tremendously. You can also work with a therapist. You can do your own meditation. There's so many free apps now. Like, there's so many things you can do. Talk to the people around you. I think having support from your circle, your family, your friends. Talk to people how you feel. Talk to your husbands, your partners, like your kids. I've heard so many people say, like, my mom's lost her shit, she's going through menopause, right? It's like people that don't really understand what their mom or their significant other or whatever is going through. So it's hard to be supportive if they don't know what you're going through and you're not sharing any of it either. focus on sleep and recovery. Again, I think sleep is literally the most underrated and overlooked tool when it comes to health. Sleep as much as you can when you can, because there might come a time where it's hard for you to sleep. So it's really important for your recovery, for your muscle mass retention, for your energy levels, obviously for your hormone balance, craving management, all of that. And then just stay away from diet trends. Like I said, like super fast, trendy diets, they might give you short-term results, but it's exactly what I talked about with delayed gratification. It's just not worth the hype. Like the short-term results at the expense of long-term consequences. Most people unfortunately have to learn by doing. You know, and a lot of the clients that I've worked with have gone through like a shit ton of other diets and that haven't worked right over time. So it's just something to consider. Like stay away from the diet trends. If they sound too good to be true, they're too good to be true. And there's no need why you should ever have to cut out like entire food groups, you know, all your carbs, only eat 5 things to make progress. And then everything we talked about, we don't really need to summarize it, but this is what I mentioned earlier. It's not that you can't make progress when you're in perimenopause. It's like it might have been really easy at one point, like you were coasting, and then it just gets harder. You're ultimately still going to a destination. The problem is so many people find this journey so difficult that they just stop or quit along the way, right? And what I always say as it relates to weight loss, and this relates to every aspect of life, like again, everything we do is hard, and I think I told you this, like being, you know, in a body you don't love or feeling how you don't love is hard, but it's also hard to like lose weight, it's hard to measure your food, it's hard to cut out foods you really crave, it's hard to cut out alcohol, it's hard to prioritize sleep if you want to do other things, but both of these things are hard. It's like you choose the hard you want to sit into, right? So you could either be unhealthy, unhappy, that's hard and fucking sucks, or you could do all these things, these are hard, but at least you feel better on the back end, so. So that's pretty much it. Any questions or anything else that I could answer, clarify? No? Thank you guys. Thank you all for coming. I know it's your Saturday, so like I said, for me the big thing is just the more knowledge I could pass on, the better, because the more we can promote, you know, everything that's female related to females, let alone men, the more helpful it's going to be for us and generations to come, honestly. So pass the message on, like Patrick said.
Please.